I gave my daughter $30,000 to help plan her dream wedding. 3 weeks later, she sent me an email saying I wasn't invited. No explanation. Just a live stream link. But what I did next, she never saw coming. If you've ever been taken for granted by the people you love most, this story will stay with you. Amber sat at her kitchen table, the early morning light spilling in through the window, casting long shadows across the floor and bathing the room in a quiet golden hush. The air still smelled faintly of rain from the night before. Her coffee, untouched, sat in a ceramic mug with the words "Best Mom Ever" printed on the side, a gift from Lena when she was 12, and still believed Amber could fix anything. Amber smiled at the memory without realizing it. A smile formed from instinct, not joy. The steam had begun to fade from her drink. She opened her laptop like she did every morning, check emails, sort bills, confirm office meetings, and saw her daughter's name sitting quietly in her inbox. No subject line. Just Lena. Amber's chest warmed. She clicked, expecting a sweet update, maybe a photo of the wedding dress or an excited rant about cake tastings or bridesmaid dresses. Lena had been busy lately, busy and distant, but Amber chalked it up to wedding stress. She understood. Weddings were a lot. She had, after all, already sent $30,000 toward the venue and early planning costs. She never expected thanks. She only hoped to feel included. Instead, she read, "Hi Mom. We've finalized the guest list for the wedding. After a lot of discussion with Andrew and his parents, we think it's best if you attend virtually. We've set up a live stream for family and friends who won't be there in person. It'll be almost like being there. Hope you understand." That was it. No "Dear Mom." No warmth. No explanation. Just a tidy little message with the emotional depth of a shipping confirmation. Amber blinked. She read it again. Then a third time. Her body remained perfectly still, like someone waiting for bad weather to pass. No gasp. No slam of the mug. No flood of tears. Instead, a strange quiet unfolded inside her like a blanket being pulled over grief. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, but she didn't type. She couldn't yet. She tried to find anger, tried to summon hurt, but what came was something colder. A clarity. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't sob, it whispers, "So this is who you are to her now." She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. It had a faint water stain in the shape of Florida. She used to joke about that when the kids were little. "Look, we've got a vacation spot right here," she'd say, pointing up while folding laundry. Lena would giggle. Jason Younger would climb the chair to trace the outline with his finger. That ceiling had watched her become a widow. It had heard her weep through job interviews, whisper promises to bills, sing lullabies through bronchitis. And now it witnessed this the moment Amber realized she wasn't really invited to her daughter's future. She thought about what had brought them here. About the compromises. The late nights. The canceled dreams. She remembered when Lena wanted to attend a private dance academy in high school. The tuition was outrageous. Amber picked up a second job cleaning medical offices at night. She remembered walking home at 1 a.m., sore and silent, so Lena could rehearse Swan Lake. When Lena got accepted to college, Amber sold the last piece of jewelry from her mother, a thin gold bracelet she'd kept for someday. That money paid for Lena's housing deposit. She thought of the times she gave up her own birthday, dinners, vacations, even dental appointments because Lena needed books, plane tickets, therapy, comfort. Once Lena called from JFK stranded after missing a connecting flight. Amber wired $600 without asking why. She hadn't planned better. That was what mothers did. They showed up. And not just with money. Amber had been there for the heartbreaks, the panic attacks, the career failures. She was the 2 a.m. phone call, the emergency contact. The name Lena rattled off when asked, "Who's your person?" Amber took a sip of her coffee. It had gone cold. Bitter. But she drank it anyway. She had grown used to things going cold around her. She looked back at the screen. It'll be almost like being there. As if her existence could be outsourced to a screen. As if her hands, the ones that sewed Lena's Halloween costumes, bandaged her scraped knees, clapped at every recital, didn't deserve to toss rose petals or fix a crooked veil. As if the woman who spent 32 years showing up could be muted and minimized to a live stream square. Was it Andrew's parents? Probably. They were polite, formal, rigid. The kind of people who used words like optics and impression. Amber remembered their frozen smiles at the engagement party, how they looked at her blazer like it had come from a thrift store. It had, but still. They offered her Chardonnay like it was charity. She tried to laugh to be warm to charm them. But she didn't fit their mold, and apparently she didn't fit in the seating chart either. She opened the reply box, her fingers hovered paused. There was so much she could say. About how hurt she felt. About how this wasn't what she raised her daughter to be. About respect and love and how invitations shouldn't need explanations. But she didn't write any of that. She didn't ask for room at the table. Instead, she gave Lena exactly what she'd asked for. Sure, enjoy your day. No anger, no punctuation. Just 4 words. She hit send. She closed the laptop. And she sat there for a long time staring out the window watching a neighbor walk their dog. The world went on. Birds still chirped. The coffee was still bitter. The email was still real. And inside Amber, something began to shift. Not a breakdown. A reckoning. Amber left the house at 7:42 a.m., exactly the time she always did. Her coat was buttoned up neatly, her keys clipped to her worn leather bag, her hair pulled back in a low knot that had become her signature clean, competent, invisible. The coffee she'd poured into her travel mug was the same blend she always drank, Colombian. Dark roast, a splash of oat milk, but it tasted different now. Or maybe everything did. The neighborhood looked the same. The early spring air was crisp, the sidewalks still damp from yesterday's rain, but Amber noticed none of it. Her body moved out of habit, her face fixed in the expression she wore most comfortably, calm, composed, unbothered. But inside her chest, a quiet earthquake was rearranging everything she thought she understood about love. Traffic was light, the drive familiar. She passed the grocery store where she used to take Lena every Saturday morning for donuts and chores. They used to make a game of it. Amber would let her pick one sugary cereal, then balance it on her head like a crown while they strolled the aisles. That aisle now only held echoes. By the time she reached the office, she'd convinced her face to behave. Caldwell, Walker and Hartfield was housed in a brick building with ivy trailing its edges and a receptionist who wore bright lipstick no matter the season. Amber had worked there for almost 18 years. The place didn't sparkle, but it was steady. And for a long time, that's all she'd wanted, something solid to anchor her after everything else had fallen apart. She nodded good morning to the front desk and walked down the hallway to her cubicle, the hum of printers and the smell of fresh paper oddly grounding. Her inbox was already full, contracts to proof, calendar invites to coordinate, staff schedules to realign. She slid into her chair, placed her coffee to the left, and opened her computer. Her fingers moved over the keys with practiced ease, but her mind refused to follow. The words on the screen blurred into meaningless shapes. All she could see was the phrase looping silently inside her. It's best if you attend virtually. The absurdity of it might have made her laugh if it hadn't cut so cleanly. A wedding wasn't a Zoom meeting. She was Lena's mother. She had raised her alone. She'd paid for that venue, chosen not to retire early, skipped every indulgence she might have allowed herself in order to make Lena's life more possible. When Lena's father died, Amber had been 36. Jason was 4. Lena was 7 and angry at the world for taking away her favorite bedtime storyteller. Amber hadn't had time to fall apart. There were mortgages, grief, counseling, appointments, school lunches, and the terrifying responsibility of keeping 2 small humans alive while her own world collapsed. She still remembered the funeral. Not the eulogies or the flowers or the condolences, but the way Lena clung to her waist and whispered, "What happens now?" Amber hadn't known the answer. But she had smiled anyway, knelt down and said, "Now we hold on to each other, okay?" And she had meant it. Every day since then she had kept that promise. Amber refocused on the screen. A contract needed signatures. She clicked, reviewed, made corrections, and read. Her fingers moved, but her heart didn't. The numbness was creeping, the kind that didn't hurt because it had passed hurt and arrived at something hollower. She took a long sip of her coffee. Cold again. She didn't warm it. She didn't care. Mid-morning, Robert stopped by. He was one of the firm's partners, gray hair, gentle eyes, a man who remembered birthdays and asked about your weekend like he meant it. He held 2 coffees and set one on her desk without a word. Amber looked up surprised. "You look like someone told you your dog ran away," he said, trying for humor but landing gently. Amber opened her mouth, considered the truth, and then closed it again. She offered a small smile instead. "Didn't sleep well." He nodded, not pushing. "Let me know if you need anything." That almost undid her. Not the coffee. Not the comment. The not pushing. The kindness of being seen without being interrogated. She watched him walk away, her throat tightening around words she wouldn't say. She thought again about Lena's email. Not just the words, but the tone. It wasn't cruel, that might have been easier to swallow. It was distant. Formal, efficient. Like Amber was no longer a person, just a problem to solve, a line item to shift from attending to virtual. And the worst part was it wasn't sudden. Not really, the distance had been growing for years. Amber just hadn't let herself name it. She'd rationalized Lena's cancelled visits, the shorter calls, the months between check-ins. She's building her life, Amber had told herself. She's busy. She'll come back around. But now she saw it. The slow fade, the shifting orbit. Somewhere along the way, Amber had stopped being her mother and become her safety net. Reliable. Replaceable. Background. She stared at her reflection in the black screen of her locked computer. Her eyes looked tired. Not old, just tired. Worn from decades of giving. I never kept score, she thought. I just kept giving. As if love could be measured by how much of yourself you erased. A soft ping pulled her back to the present. Another email, another task, another thing to do. She clicked it open and resumed typing, her spine straight, her face unreadable. No one at the office noticed that something had broken. Not loudly. Just a quiet shift in the tectonic plates beneath her soul. No one saw how Amber's silence wasn't peaceful, it was armor. She finished her coffee. It was still cold. And so was everything else. Amber left the office at 4:12 p.m. A little earlier than usual, but not enough to raise questions. She told her assistant she had an appointment, technically true. The sky had started to shift toward the muted hues of late afternoon, and the wind carried a chill that reminded her spring was still unsure of itself. She walked 2 blocks past the cafe, past the florist she once took Lena to for prom corsages, and stopped in front of First Federal Bank. It looked exactly as it always had, modest brick exterior, white letters slightly faded from sun, but somehow stepping inside felt different today. The air conditioning hit her face, crisp and clinical. She could still smell the faint scent of lemon polish on the counters. Carlos was at his desk as usual. He had helped Amber with nearly everything financial over the years, setting up Lena's college fund, refinancing the house after her husband passed, rolling over her modest retirement plan after layoffs at her old job. He was efficient, kind, and always remembered that she liked her receipts printed, not emailed. When he saw her, he stood with a familiar smile. "Mrs. Bennett," he greeted. "It's been a while. What can I do for you today?" Amber approached the desk calmly. Her hands weren't shaking, her heart wasn't racing. Everything inside her had settled into something unnervingly steady, like a lake after a storm. She placed her handbag gently on the floor and met his eyes. "I need to cancel a wire transfer," she said, her voice smooth even. Carlos blinked. "Okay. Do you have the transaction details?" Amber nodded, handing over the folder she had brought. It contained the scheduled transfer of $50,000 to a Napa Valley wedding venue. One she had chosen herself after Lena showed her Instagram photos with captions like "Dream Spot" and "Can't believe this is real." Amber had smiled at the time, thrilled to make it possible. Carlos scanned the paperwork, then paused. "This was set to process tomorrow morning," he said, frowning lightly. "It's a large amount." His eyes flicked up to meet hers. "May I ask? Is everything okay?" Amber considered lying. Saying the wedding was postponed, saying something about a double booking or a change of plans. But instead, she looked him directly in the eye and said, "The circumstances have changed." Carlos stared at her for a beat longer than necessary, then nodded slowly. "I see." He clicked through a few screens, verifying information, typing quietly. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Almost like grief. Amber sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Her gaze drifted to the window where a young woman waited at the ATM, shoulders hunched, coat unzipped. She looked like Lena once had, hurried, bright, hopeful. Amber watched her punch in numbers with urgency, then glance around like the world might shift in the time it took to process her balance. It struck Amber suddenly how many times she had withdrawn not just money, but parts of herself for her daughter. Little withdrawals she never expected to be repaid. When Lena changed her major from environmental science to journalism, Amber had smiled and said, "Of course." When she switched again to psychology 6 months later, Amber adjusted the family budget without blinking. She canceled a weekend getaway with friends to help Lena move apartments again, this time across the state. And when Lena started therapy after a breakup that had left her hollow and gray-eyed, Amber picked up the bill. No questions asked. No expectations. Just a mother doing what mothers do. She remembered writing checks while eating ramen at home. Remembered skipping her own dentist appointments to pay for Lena's textbooks. When had it stopped being generosity and started becoming sacrifice? She wasn't sure. The line had always been blurry. Carlos cleared his throat gently. "You're in luck," he said. "The wire hasn't processed. We can cancel it without penalty." Amber nodded. "Good." He hesitated. "Just to confirm." "You're sure?" Amber offered a thin smile. "Yes. I'm sure." He tapped a final key and printed a confirmation slip. "That's done then," he said, sliding the paper across the desk. She glanced at the total again. $50,000. She had already sent $30,000 weeks ago. $80,000 for a wedding she wasn't welcome to attend. A celebration she had funded but been left out of. It would have been easier if Lena had asked for less. Somehow the abundance made the exclusion feel sharper. As if Amber had value but only in dollars. She stood, thanked Carlos, and walked out into the cooling afternoon. The light was dimmer now, the sky painted in low golds and purples. Her footsteps were steady. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel broken. She felt done. By the time she got home, her phone had 3 missed calls from Lena, 1 from Jason, and a voicemail she didn't listen to. She turned off the ringer and left the phone in her purse. In the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of red wine, the bottle she'd been saving for Thanksgiving back when Lena promised she'd come home but canceled last minute. Work emergency, she'd said, then posted photos from a vineyard that weekend. Amber stepped out onto her porch, glass in hand, sweater draped around her shoulders. The neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere, wind chimes played a hollow tune. She took a sip and let the silence settle over her. It didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. And for the first time in years, she wondered what it might mean to start spending her money and her energy on herself. The first call came just after 7 p.m. as Amber was rinsing her wine glass. The screen lit up with Lena's name pulsing like a lighthouse in the dark. She didn't answer. She watched it ring until it stopped. Then it rang again. 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 7 times in 20 minutes, all from Lena. Then 3 from Jason. The voicemail icon blinked silently, a growing weight in her chest, but she made no move to listen. Instead, she folded the dish towel slowly and placed it across the handle of the oven. She moved through the house like someone settling in for a quiet evening, but her body held a strange tension, as if expecting an aftershock. She didn't feel guilt. That surprised her. She had expected to feel cracked open or at least conflicted. But instead she felt steady. Not numb, not hard. Just sure. By 8:00 the calls had multiplied. Texts flooded in. Some short and frantic, "Mom, please answer." Others passive-aggressive. "I don't understand what you're doing." One was almost laughable. "You're being unfair. This isn't about you." She let them all pass by like traffic she could hear from the sidewalk, but had no desire to join. At 8:43 the doorbell rang. Amber knew before she opened it that it wouldn't be Lena. Her daughter didn't show up without warning, hadn't in years. It was Jason. Her son stood on the porch in his work clothes, sleeves rolled up, tie askew, phone still in hand like a weapon. His hair was damp from either sweat or stress, and his eyes scanned her face with urgency. Mom, he said, stepping in before she could respond. Why aren't you answering your phone? Lena's freaking out. Amber closed the door behind him with the same calm she'd used all day. Hello, to you too, she said, voice even. Jason ran a hand through his hair. She says you canceled the wedding payment, that you're not coming, that you're not even responding. His voice pitched higher. What's going on? Amber moved past him into the living room and sat down on the arm of the couch. What's going on? She echoed, more to herself than him. Jason didn't sit. He paced. They're counting on that money. You already sent 30. They were planning the rest based on I know exactly what they were planning, she said, not unkindly. Jason stopped pacing. So what is this? Punishment? Amber looked at her son, nearly 30, kind, responsible, loyal. He had never asked for much. He didn't drain her the way Lena did, but he also didn't understand her. Not truly. Not deeply. It's not punishment, she said quietly. It's a boundary. He blinked. Oh, what a line, she said. One I should have drawn a long time ago. Jason's frustration cracked open. Mom, this is a wedding, her wedding. And now everything's falling apart because you. What? Got your feelings hurt? The words hit the air with a sharpness Amber hadn't expected. Not because they were new, but because they sounded so familiar. They sounded like every time she had swallowed her own needs in the name of being supportive. Every time her discomfort had been labeled dramatic. Every time she'd been told her sacrifices were invisible because she never made a show of them. She stood slowly. Not to confront him. Just because it felt wrong to sit beneath that. I spent 32 years making sure your sister never had to feel unsafe, Amber said. Never had to question if someone was in her corner. I paid. I showed up. I kept showing up even when she stopped asking. Even when she stopped noticing. Jason crossed his arms. That's what parents do. Amber nodded. Yes. And I did it willingly. I never kept score, Jason. I just kept giving. But there's a difference between love and being used. I didn't even get a phone call, just an email. A live stream link. Jason shifted. It wasn't her idea alone. Andrew's parents. She raised a hand. I don't care whose idea it was. She's my daughter. If she wanted me there, I'd be there. He fell silent. Amber walked to the window and looked out. The porch light had flicked on automatically. A moth bumped against the glass. It's not about the money, she said after a while. It's about being treated like a burden. Like an inconvenience. I was good enough to fund the dream, but not to witness it. Jason's voice softened. She made a mistake. She's overwhelmed. Amber turned to him. We all make mistakes. But we don't always get to fix them with other people's silence. For a moment he just stood there. Then finally, you're really not going. Amber looked him in the eye. I'm really not. He exhaled sharply and rubbed his temples. You always make everything about yourself. And that was it. The sentence, the trigger, the quiet betrayal inside the assumption that having boundaries meant being selfish. Amber felt the shift again, not a snap, not a scream, just something ancient and deep finally falling into place. She stepped forward, her voice calm. Get out of my house. Jason froze. What? You heard me? He looked stunned. Mom, no yelling. No drama, just go. Jason stared at her and for a moment she thought he might cry or yell or plead. But instead he just nodded once, short, confused, defensive, and walked to the door. The click behind him was soft. But it echoed louder than any slammed door ever could. Amber stood in the living room staring at the space he had just occupied. Her hands didn't shake, her chest didn't ache. What she felt wasn't regret. It was peace. A terrifying, unfamiliar peace. Amber waited until the house had returned to stillness. After Jason left, the silence didn't feel angry, it felt earned. She turned off the porch light and walked back into the kitchen. The familiar hum of the refrigerator, the creak in the third floorboard, these small, dependable things comforted her in a way her children no longer did. Her eyes settled on the bottle of wine on the top shelf of the pantry tucked behind a stack of cookbooks she hadn't opened in years. It was a Cabernet she had been saving for Thanksgiving 2 years ago, the one Lena had promised emphatically tearfully to come home for. "This time I mean it, Mom. I already blocked the weekend." Amber had cooked for 2 days straight. Made her daughter's favorite sweet potato casserole. Ironed the linen napkins. Set the table with the blue dishes she only used on holidays. Lena canceled the morning of. Sent a text. "So sorry. Work crisis. Love you." That night Amber ate dinner alone with the television on low, the wine unopened. Until now. She retrieved the bottle, uncorked it with quiet precision, and poured herself a generous glass. The deep red liquid caught the fading light as she stepped outside to the porch. The sky was painted in bruised purples and soft blues. Across the street, someone's sprinkler ticked in rhythmic arcs over a manicured lawn. A dog barked 2 houses down. Birds murmured in the trees overhead. The world carried on. Amber sat in the old rocking chair, the one she'd bought secondhand when Jason was a baby. The wood had worn smooth from years of use, the arms sun-bleached and familiar. She curled her legs beneath her and took a long sip. It was good wine. Rich. Earthy. Comforting. She let it sit on her tongue a moment longer than necessary before swallowing. Her eyes wandered without focus, and her mind unbidden began to drift backward, as it often did now. Not to grand memories, but to the quiet, invisible ones. The ones nobody remembered but her. There was the birthday Lena missed when Amber turned 50. Lena had sent flowers and a voicemail. Amber had told herself it was sweet, but she'd cried into her grocery store cake that night, or the time Lena forgot Mother's Day entirely. Jason had dropped by with a mug and a hug. Lena had texted at 4 p.m. a single heart emoji. Amber had responded with a smiley face. She had always covered the gaps with grace. She thought about Christmas 2 years ago. Lena had promised to fly in, but a snowstorm rerouted her plans. Amber had packed away the gifts she bought, the leather gloves, the framed photo of their trip to the coast, the handwritten letter she'd never gotten the courage to give. It was still in the drawer of her nightstand, sealed unread. And then one memory came sharper than the rest. Amber had been shopping for winter boots. Her own were cracked at the soles, the leather flaking, the insoles thinning. She'd found a pair she loved, real leather, soft lining, on sale. She'd tried them on twice in the store, walking back and forth in front of the mirror, admiring the way they hugged her ankles. But just as she reached for her card, her phone buzzed. Lena. Her daughter was in tears. Her roommate had moved out unexpectedly. Rent was due in 5 days. Amber had murmured, "Don't worry, sweetheart," as she took off the boots and put them back on the shelf. She'd wired the money that afternoon. That winter her socks got wet every time it snowed. She never told anyone. Not because she expected praise, but because she had learned long ago that sacrifice when quiet keeps the peace. Amber took another sip of wine and felt something shift in her throat, not a sob, just a tightness. Her eyes stung, but no tears fell. She didn't want to cry. She just wanted to feel all of it without apology. She remembered walking to work that winter in those old boots, feet frozen, hands tucked in her sleeves. She'd passed a boutique and seen a mother and daughter laughing through the glass, trying on scarves. She had told herself, "One day, Lena and I will do that. One day when she has time," but time had always been the thing Amber gave, not the thing she received. The stars began to bloom overhead one by one like cautious witnesses. Amber leaned back in the rocker, the glass warm in her hand. She wondered, not bitterly but honestly, if Lena had ever really seen her. Not just as the reliable giver, the constant rescuer, the one who made things work, but as a woman. A full person. Someone who had dreams before they were folded neatly into someone else's needs. She thought about what it meant to be a mother, and what it meant now to stop mothering. Not because she didn't love her children, but because love that forgets itself becomes something hollow. Another sip. The porch light flickered on. Amber closed her eyes. She didn't know what came next, not exactly. But she knew this something had ended. Quietly. Finally. And from that ending something else could begin. Not a new role. Not a new version of herself to fit someone's needs. But a return. To the woman she had almost forgotten. Amber woke the next morning with sunlight bleeding across her bedsheets. It felt different somehow. Not lighter, not brighter, but quieter. As if the grief had settled into its corners and stopped scratching at the walls. The calls had stopped sometime during the night. Her phone, still silenced, sat untouched on the dresser. No more buzzing. No more blinking red numbers like a guilt meter. Just stillness. She padded into the kitchen, started the coffee, and sat down at the table with a pen and a pad of paper, both untouched in weeks. She stared at the blank page for a long time, unsure what to write, unsure why she had reached for the pen at all. But something inside her needed to be heard. And not by Lena. Not by Jason, by herself. She wrote, "Dear Amber, thank you for surviving. Thank you for choosing to keep going when your heart broke quietly, when no one noticed, when the meals you made were left uneaten and the calls you waited for never came. Thank you for holding space for everyone else's pain, even when you're sat unanswered in your chest. Thank you for keeping the lights on, the laundry folded, the fridge full, and your arms open, always open. I'm sorry I forgot to ask you what you needed. I'm sorry I only clapped for you silently in the kitchen after everyone had left the stage. You were never just a mother. You were always a woman with dreams and ache and poetry under your skin. I see you now. I won't forget again. Love me." When she finished, her hands trembled, not from weakness but from release. She folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and tucked it between two books on the shelf. She didn't need anyone else to read it. The act of writing it was the healing. Later that morning at work, something shifted. She wasn't lighter, but she was grounded. She answered emails, coordinated meetings, corrected a clause in a merger contract that would have cost the firm thousands. She did it all without the usual fog. For the first time in days, her mind returned to her body. Near noon, Robert passed by her desk holding his usual to-go coffee cup and a small brown paper bag. "Lunch?" he asked casually. Amber nearly said no. Out of habit, she almost reached for an excuse: deadlines, errands, tiredness. But then she stopped herself. She hadn't eaten lunch out in months. Hadn't sat in the sun, hadn't allowed herself anything that didn't serve someone else's needs. She looked up and smiled. "I'd like that." They walked to a new Italian cafe down the block, one she'd passed a dozen times but never entered. It had white tablecloths and a chalkboard menu and too much light. She loved it immediately. Robert ordered lasagna. Amber chose butternut squash ravioli with sage butter. When the food arrived, they talked easily about his grandchildren, about the state of legal affairs, about the absurdity of HOA rules. Then, after a pause, Robert looked at her with soft curiosity. "Forgive me, Amber, but you seem different this week." She considered brushing it off. But something about his tone, the genuine care in it, made her answer honestly. "I canceled a wedding payment," she said. "To my daughter's venue. She disinvited me, said I should watch it online." Robert blinked, fork halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully. "I'm so sorry." Amber shrugged gently. "I'm not. Not anymore." She told him the whole story, succinct, clear, not bitter. And he listened. Really listened. No advice, no silver linings, just quiet presence. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he said, "the hardest part of love is setting boundaries with the ones we gave everything to." Amber looked at him for a long moment. No one had ever said it that plainly before. It landed in her chest like a stone, but not a sinking one. A steadying one. "Thank you," she said softly. That evening, she passed by the community center on her way home. A small flyer taped to the window caught her eye. "Beginner pottery, Wednesdays at 6, first class free. No experience needed." She stared at it for a moment longer than necessary. Then stepped inside. The woman at the front desk had curly hair and a nose ring and greeted Amber like she was expected. "First time?" she asked. Amber nodded. "Yes. I think so." She filled out the form, handed over the modest fee, and tucked the schedule into her purse. That night, Amber didn't check her phone. She didn't reread Lena's messages. She didn't wonder what came next in their fractured relationship. Instead, she made tea. She put on music she loved but hadn't played in years, some old jazz with gravel voices and soft pianos, and sat with a novel in her lap and her feet tucked under a blanket. She hadn't forgiven Lena. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she had begun to forgive herself for disappearing in the name of being needed. The next week she would show up to the pottery class in old jeans and a nervous heart. She would touch clay for the first time since grade school. And she would feel it, something ancient, something gentle start to take shape in her hands. Not a bowl, not a mug, but maybe, just maybe, a new life. The email came on a Thursday morning just as Amber was slipping her arms into her cardigan and pouring the last of the coffee into her travel mug. The subject line caught her eye: "Please don't ruin my wedding." She paused. The subject didn't sting. It didn't even surprise her, but it made her tilt her head in quiet recognition, the same way she used to recognize manipulations in legal documents, not aggressive, just calculated. She sat down at the table and clicked it open. "Mom, I know you're upset about the Livestream thing, and I probably could have handled it better. But this has gone too far. We've lost the venue deposit. The caterer is threatening to pull out if the final payment isn't made by end-of-day Paris time. Andrew's parents are furious. They said this proves you're unreasonable and dramatic. I defended you at first, but I don't know what to say anymore. This isn't what I wanted. I wanted you there, but it's complicated. Andrew's mom had a vision and we tried to accommodate everyone. Maybe we went too far. If you send the money, we'll find a way for you to attend. Maybe a smaller welcome dinner or even something at the rehearsal. We can work something out. Please don't let this ruin everything." Lena Amber read it once. Then again slowly. She sipped her coffee as the words settled like dust around her. The tone was familiar, too familiar. Not an apology. A negotiation, an offer. A half step toward healing that required a full payment in return. There was no "I'm sorry I hurt you." No "I see what I did." No acknowledgement of the core wound. Just logistics. Just numbers. Just "if you give, we'll allow." Amber leaned back in her chair and stared out the window. The neighbor's dog barked at a squirrel on the fence. The world turned as usual. And inside her, something astonishing happened. She smiled. Not bitterly. Not smugly. But with a quiet sadness. The kind that comes when you finally stop expecting someone to become who they're not. She didn't reply. She didn't even open the draft window. Instead, she opened her planner, circled Wednesday night's pottery class, and wrote in small cursive beneath it: "Center yourself. Let the clay teach you softness again." She closed the laptop. That night she lit a candle after dinner, not for ambience but because she wanted to. She played an old record Jason had bought her years ago and danced alone in the kitchen, her bare feet moving over tile like they were remembering music again. Her phone buzzed again at 11:17 p.m. Another message from Lena. "Why won't you answer me? I'm trying here. This is your daughter. Don't you care about making this right?" Amber looked at the screen and gently turned the phone over face down. Yes, she thought. I care. I care so much that I'm finally choosing not to play a part in a story that only calls me in when the budget breaks. The next morning at work, Robert stopped by her desk as he often did. He had a new book recommendation. Something about memory and forgiveness. "You seem peaceful lately," he said, smiling. Amber nodded. "I think I stopped trying to be necessary." He raised an eyebrow. "And how's that going?" She thought for a moment. "Quiet," she said. "But clear." Over lunch she told him about the email. Not the details, just the essence. A conditional invitation. A love that showed up when attached to a bank transfer. Robert stirred his tea thoughtfully. "People will offer you a seat at their table only when you bring something they want," he said. "But you deserve to sit without having to pay for the chair." Amber looked out the cafe window, watching a group of teenagers laugh in oversized hoodies and headphones. "I used to think love was about proving myself," she said. "Earning my place over and over. Now I think it's about being okay if no one claps when you stand." That weekend she got a letter in the mail. From Lena. Handwritten. 5 pages long. It was a strange blend of grief, defensiveness, half apologies, and circular logic. Lena said she was sorry if Amber felt hurt, but also reminded her of all the things she'd done for her over the years. She asked if Amber wanted to rebuild this bridge and closed with, "I just wish you would try harder to understand where we're coming from." Amber folded the letter carefully and slid it into the same drawer where her own note to herself rested. Two voices, two truths, two women no longer orbiting each other. She didn't feel cold. She didn't feel angry. She felt finished with begging, with performing, with exchanging her presence for conditional love. That Sunday, she made soup. Not because anyone was visiting, just because she liked the smell of rosemary in the house. She sat on the porch with a bowl and a book, and when the wind stirred the trees, she whispered, "I'm still a mother. But I'm also Amber." And for once that was enough. It was a quiet Tuesday evening. The kind of evening where the sky held onto the last strands of daylight a little longer and the breeze through the open kitchen window smelled faintly of cut grass. Amber was washing the dinner dishes when the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. Wiping her hands on a dish towel, she walked slowly toward the door. Through the narrow glass pane, she saw a young woman, mid-30s, maybe. Long dark hair, a beige trench coat, posture uncertain. Familiar though the years had blurred the sharpness of memory. Amber opened the door. "Mrs. Bennett," the woman asked gently. Amber blinked. Madison, Reynolds, Lena's childhood best friend. The girl who had spent summers in their backyard, jumping through sprinklers, building forts out of sheets, whispering secrets with sticky popsicle fingers. She hadn't seen her in, 15 years? 20. Yes, Madison smiled shyly. "I hope it's okay I stopped by. I was in town for work, and well, I heard things were tense." Amber nodded once and stepped aside. "Of course. Come in." Madison entered the living room, her eyes scanning the space like it held echoes of childhood. She sat on the edge of the couch like someone who didn't want to overstay. Amber poured them both tea. Chamomile. Soft and safe. They sat in silence for a minute. The air held something delicate, like walking across a frozen pond, both aware that one wrong word could crack the surface. "I spoke to Lena yesterday," Madison finally said, wrapping her fingers around the mug. "She's a mess. I mean that with love, but she's unraveling." Amber raised an eyebrow, not in sarcasm, just listening. Madison continued, "She knows she handled it wrong. She knows the wedding's falling apart without your help, but mostly, she doesn't know how to fix it." Amber nodded slowly. "And that's why you're here." Madison hesitated. "I'm not here to convince you. Honestly, I don't think I could. But I told her I'd try to understand." So she looked up, her voice clear but soft. "Is there anything she can say to fix it?" Amber didn't respond right away. She looked out the window where the garden lights had flicked on automatically. The ivy along the fence trembled in the breeze. Then she turned back to Madison. "No," she said gently. Madison blinked. "No," Amber shook her head, "because love should never wait until you're gone to be seen." The words settled between them like a truth neither one could push away. "She's not a bad person," Madison said quietly. "I know," Amber replied. "She's just young and overwhelmed." Amber gave a soft, sad smile. "I was younger than her when I became a widow. Overwhelmed didn't give me the luxury to forget who mattered." Madison looked down into her tea. "You're right." They sat like that, two women from different chapters of life sharing the same quiet sadness. Madison looked at Amber not with pity but with reverence. There was strength in her. Not loud, not performative, just solid. Rooted. "She says she's trying," Madison offered. Amber nodded. "Trying looks different when you're not asking someone to pay for your effort." Another silence. Then Madison asked, "Do you hate her?" Amber answered without hesitation. "Number. But I've stopped needing her to love me in a way that costs me everything." Madison's eyes glistened and she smiled, small, grateful. "I think I needed to hear that too." Amber tilted her head. "Why, I'm getting married next spring," Madison admitted. "And I've already started turning into someone I don't recognize. Counting Instagram likes instead of phone calls. Snapping at my mom when she asks about colors instead of asking how she's feeling. I don't want to be someone who wakes up and realizes she lost something real chasing something curated." Amber placed a hand over Madison's. Then don't. It was that simple. And that difficult. Madison nodded. Thank you. For seeing me. Even now. Amber smiled. You are always welcome in this house. They stood. Madison wrapped her arms around Amber, and it wasn't a casual hug, it was long present real. A passing of something between generations. At the door, Madison hesitated. I don't know if Lena will get it. At least, not now. She might, Amber said. Or she might not. That's not my job anymore. And just like that, Madison was gone, the night folding in around the porch. Amber stood for a long while after she closed the door. She didn't cry, she didn't feel triumphant, she just felt, witnessed. Sometimes it wasn't about being forgiven, or about getting the apology you deserved. Sometimes healing came when someone finally looked you in the eye and said, I see you. And meant it. The pottery studio smelled like wet earth and eucalyptus. It was tucked behind the community center in a sunlit room filled with wheels and wooden shelves lined with half-finished bowls and vases in every shade of glaze. The tables were speckled with dried clay dust and finger marks like soft fossil imprints of people trying to shape their own healing. Amber stood awkwardly near the back apron tied too tightly, a lump of cool heavy clay in front of her. She hadn't touched clay since elementary school. Her hands didn't quite know what to do, but something inside her did. The instructor, a gentle woman named Teresa with deep smile lines and flower-dusted sneakers, walked her through the basics. You don't control it, she said, her voice like chamomile. You meet it where it is. You listen. Clay tells you what it needs. Amber liked that. It sounded less like art and more like relationship. Like the one she was finally trying to have with herself. She sat at the wheel and pressed the pedal slowly. It began to spin. She wet her hands and placed them on the lump of clay. It was firmer than she expected. Resistant. But not immovable. Beside her sat a woman in her late 60s with short silver hair and large turquoise earrings. She looked like she'd once been a painter or a protester or both. Her name was Carolyn. They exchanged polite smiles at first, then quiet observations. Your hands remember faster than your head. This wheel wobbles a little. I haven't done something just for me in years. After a while, Carolyn turned to her and said, You're new to starting over, aren't you? Amber nodded. Yes. And no. Carolyn smiled. Same. They didn't exchange stories at first, just the rhythms of clay water pressure. But eventually, as their hands worked and their guards lowered, the truths began to spill out. My daughter hasn't spoken to me in 3 years, Carolyn said quietly. Said I was too controlling, too protective. Too much. She paused. I probably was, but I wasn't trying to be. I just didn't know how else to love. Amber didn't respond right away. She just kept shaping the base of what might become a cup. My daughter disinvited me from her wedding, she said softly. Sent an email. No call, just a live stream link. Carolyn exhaled. God. Amber smiled faintly. It was a relief in a strange way. Gave me permission to leave a story I was no longer part of. They sat in silence again, the wheel spinning. The clay softened beneath their fingers, becoming something new. Amber's cup was not symmetrical, its lip was uneven. The body leaned slightly left. But it stood. It held. It was hers. She placed it gently on the drying rack and stepped back, wiping her hands. It wasn't perfect, but it was made with intention. After class, Carolyn invited her for tea. They sat on a bench outside the studio, paper cups in hand, watching the sun dip low over the parking lot. I used to think motherhood was about disappearing gracefully, Carolyn said. Now I think it's about remembering you were always there even when they stopped seeing you. Amber nodded. I spent so long trying to be someone worth loving that I forgot I already was. They sipped quietly. Somewhere nearby, someone's child laughed. But it didn't sting. Not anymore. Back home, Amber placed her clay cup on the windowsill. It was still drying, fragile in the way new things are. She looked at it not with critique, but with affection. This was her first creation. Not for Lena. Not for Jason. Not for anyone's approval. just for Amber. That weekend the wedding happened, or at least what was left of it. Jason had texted her a photo Lena in a backyard wearing a simpler dress under a string of cafe lights. Andrew's parents were nowhere to be seen. The caption said, "She went through with it anyway." Amber didn't reply. Not out of spite, but because there was nothing to say. She had already left the room. The story no longer belonged to her. Instead, she spent that Saturday morning at the farmer's market with Carolyn. They bought honey from a local vendor, sampled rosemary bread, talked about books, the price of peaches, the strange beauty of late-life friendships. Amber laughed easily now. Not constantly, but when she did, it felt unfiltered, like air being let back into a sealed room. She no longer checked her phone every hour, no longer braced herself for Lena's messages, no longer rehearsed speeches in the shower or drafted unsent responses in her mind. She was done begging to be chosen. She had chosen herself. Amber turned 60 on a quiet Sunday that unfolded gently like the first page of a novel she hadn't yet read. There were no balloons tied to the mailbox, no family members gathered in the kitchen laughing over mimosas, no phone calls arriving at midnight to be the first to say happy birthday. She woke slowly wrapped in the linen sheets she had bought for herself last Christmas because no one else had thought to ask what she wanted. The house was still. No music, no voices. Just the steady hum of the refrigerator and the soft groan of wooden floorboards expanding under the first touch of morning sun. She moved deliberately, pouring coffee into the ceramic mug she'd made herself in pottery class 2 weeks earlier. The lip was uneven, but it fit her hands perfectly. She stood in the kitchen barefoot, watching the steam rise from her cup-like memory, and walked to the mirror in the hallway where her reflection met her eyes with a quiet certainty. She studied herself for a long moment, not critically, not with judgment, just with the curiosity of someone reacquainting herself with a person long neglected. The fine lines around her mouth told the story of a woman who had smiled for others for decades, who had been the backbone and background of every room, the quiet fixer, the reliable giver. She tilted her head slightly and said out loud, not as a question but as a vow, "If my presence is negotiable, then so is my effort." The sentence rang out not like defiance, but like truth, steady, unfaltering. She wrote the words down on a sticky note and pressed it to the edge of the mirror, not to remind herself, but to mark the turning point. That morning she made herself breakfast, not toast over the sink or a protein bar in the car, but a real meal: scrambled eggs with rosemary, roasted tomatoes, and buttered toast. She plated it carefully, sat at the table with the window cracked open, and listened to the birds. No one was watching, no one needed anything from her. And still she showed up for herself. Afterward she read a chapter of a novel she had been meaning to finish for months, the pages now finally able to hold her full attention. She showered and chose to wear her favorite blouse, even with nowhere to go. She took a walk around the neighborhood and admired the way the sunlight filtered through the elm trees, how the air smelled faintly of honeysuckle. She stopped by the bookstore and bought a new journal, leather-bound, smooth pages, no lines, because she was tired of fitting her words into pre-drawn boxes. When she returned home, there was an email. From Lena. The subject line was soft but weighted. "I'm sorry." Amber sat down, heart steady, and opened it. The message was long. Lena apologized, kind of. She said she hadn't realized how hurtful the Livestream suggestion was. She explained that Andrew's parents had strong opinions, that she felt caught in the middle, that she didn't know how to make everyone happy. She said she missed Amber. That she had been scared. That she didn't think Amber would ever stop showing up. That the silence had been more painful than expected. But there was no real reckoning in the words, only longing, only confusion. There was no moment where Lena said, "I see you now. Only please say something." Amber read it once. Then closed the laptop. She didn't write back, not because she didn't love her daughter, but because she did. And because love, real love, doesn't always mean stepping back into a room where you're only invited after the damage is done. Instead, Amber went to the garden. She pulled weeds with bare hands, trimmed the lavender, watered the tomatoes. She placed her hand on the warm terracotta of the raised bed and whispered to the soil, "This is enough." That evening she cooked again, soup, this time with crusty bread and thyme. She lit a candle and played a record, jazz, soft and slow. She set the table for one without sadness. Just reverence. Later, as dusk settled into the edges of the windows, she walked to the mirror again. The sticky note was still there. If my presence is negotiable, then so is my effort. She read it and smiled, not because she needed the reminder, but because she had finally stopped forgetting. Her phone buzzed once more that night. Another message. She didn't check, she didn't brace. She simply walked to the porch, sat in the old rocking chair with a blanket over her lap, and let the cool air kiss her cheeks. The stars emerged one by one, slow and deliberate, and in their glow, she spoke aloud the words she'd once only thought in the silence between acts of sacrifice. You don't have to burn yourself to keep others warm. And in that moment, she wasn't waiting for anyone to come home. She already was.